In the early 1960s, the United States military faced a mathematical nightmare. They were preparing to fight a war in a place where the geography itself was the primary enemy. The dense, triple canopy jungles of Vietnam didn't just hide the North Vietnamese army. They rendered traditional Western military doctrine, built on heavy tanks, massive supply lines, and established frontline trenches, completely obsolete. Commanders stared at maps of the Central Highlands and the Mekong Delta and saw a graveyard for conventional infantry. To win, they needed to do the impossible. They needed to ignore the ground entirely.
You've seen the movies. You've heard Ride of the Valkyries blaring from speakers. You think you know the story of the helicopter war. But there is a darker, more calculated, and far more brutal reason why these pilots became the masters of the Vietnamese sky. It wasn't just about speed, and it wasn't just about firepower. It was because the American High Command had discovered a terrifying new way to use the helicopter. Not just as a transport vehicle, but as a meat grinder catalyst for a strategy of pure attrition.
Today we're looking at the engineering breakthroughs, the massive egos, and the brutal tactical reality behind why the Huey pilot became the most important and most vulnerable player in the Vietnam War. This is the story of how a machine changed the nature of combat and the dark price paid by the men who flew them into the green abyss. Most people have heard that Vietnam was a war without fronts. But what does that actually mean for a soldier on the ground? In World War II, you knew where the enemy was. They were behind the line of bunkers across the field. In Vietnam, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Before 1961, if you wanted to move a battalion through the jungle, you had to hack through it with machetes at a rate of sometimes as slow as 1 mile a day. By the time you arrived at your objective, the enemy had moved, set an ambush, or simply vanished into the brush. The French had tried to solve this in the 1950s, during their own disastrous war in Indochina. They used paratroopers, dropping them from C-47s into clearings. But once those paratroopers hit the ground, they were just as slow and just as trapped as everyone else. They were static, tied to their drop zones, and easily surrounded, as seen in the catastrophic defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The US Army looked at the French failure and realized they couldn't just drop men into the jungle. They had to be able to pick them up, move them, and reposition them in real time. But then, a group of radical thinkers in the US Army, led by visionaries like General Hamilton Howe's, realized that the solution wasn't a better way to walk. It was a way to stop walking altogether. This led to the creation of the Howe's Board, a tactical think tank that proposed something insane at the time: the air cavalry. They didn't want the helicopter to just support the infantry. They wanted the helicopter to be the infantry's legs, its heart, and its heavy artillery. They envisioned a war where terrain no longer mattered, where a mountaintop was as accessible as a flat plain. And what they came up with would bring the fighting to a level of technical and psychological horror that neither side was truly prepared for. To understand the rise of the helicopter pilot, we have to look at the machine that made it possible. Before the late 50s, helicopters were underpowered, vibrating death traps. They used piston engines, the same heavy, temperamental kind you'd find in a large truck. They were loud, they constantly overheated in tropical climates, and they could barely lift a squad of men in the humid, thin air of the Vietnamese mountains. They were utility craft, meant for chores, not combat. That's when Bell Helicopter changed the equation, introducing a revolutionary piece of engineering, the Lycoming T53 turboshaft engine. Instead of heavy pistons moving up and down, the T53 used a jet turbine to spin the rotors. This was the breakthrough moment. The engine was small, light, and incredibly powerful for its size. It allowed Bell to create the UH-1 Iroquois, famously known as the Huey. Why did this matter? Because for the first time in history, a commander could pick up an entire company of soldiers and move them 50 miles in 20 minutes, bypassing every swamp, river, and enemy roadblock in their path. But there was a hidden problem, a technical constraint that the designers at Bell and the tacticians at the Pentagon had to wrestle with. The Huey was essentially a flying greenhouse. To keep it light enough to carry troops, fuel, and ammunition, it had almost no armor. Think about that. You are flying at 100 knots over a jungle filled with thousands of people who want to kill you, and the only thing between your body and a 50 caliber machine gun bullet is a thin sheet of aluminum and a piece of plexiglass. It was a machine built for mobility, but it achieved that mobility by sacrificing safety entirely. Let's look at the mechanical anatomy of a Huey combat mission, because the engineering details explain why the pilot's role was so intense. Flying a helicopter is fundamentally different from flying a plane. A plane wants to stay in the air. A helicopter is essentially a collection of 10,000 parts, all trying to fly in different directions at once. First, there's the Jesus nut. That's the single large nut that holds the main rotor to the mast of the helicopter. If that nut fails, the rotor detaches, and the helicopter instantly has the aerodynamic properties of a brick. Pilots lived with the constant mechanical reality that their lives depended on a single point of failure. Every vibration, every shudder of the airframe was a potential death sentence. Then there was the dead man's curve. This wasn't just a nickname, it was a technical chart pilots had to memorize. It showed the relationship between altitude and airspeed. If your engine failed while you were in the shaded part of the curve, too low or too slow, you didn't have enough kinetic energy to perform an autorotation. For the uninitiated, autorotation is a mechanical miracle. If the engine dies, the pilot disengages the rotors from the engine, letting the rushing air spin the blades as the chopper falls. At the last second, the pilot changes the pitch of the blades, using that stored energy to cushion the landing. In the tight LZs landing zones of Vietnam, surrounded by 100-foot trees and hidden stumps, performing an autorotation wasn't just a maneuver, it was a desperate act of survival. You had one shot to get it right. If you flared too early, you fell the last 20 feet. If you flared too late, you hit the ground at 60 miles per hour. Now look at the engineering details that changed the nature of the war. Most helicopters before the Huey had small doors. The Huey had massive, sliding side doors. This wasn't just for easy exit. It allowed the door gunners to mount M60 machine guns on pivoting spades. This turned the transport vehicle into a 360-degree firing platform. But here is the dark reason behind that design. The doors were often kept open not just for firing, but for safety. In a crash, which happened constantly due to ground fire or mechanical failure, the frame of the Huey would often warp, jamming the doors shut. Pilots and door gunners learned that if you wanted to get out of a burning wreck alive, you flew with the world wide open, exposed to every sniper in the tree line. By 1965, the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile arrived in Vietnam. This was the real-world testing of the houseboard's dream, and it's here where we find the dark reason America's pilots ruled the sky. The strategy of the U.S. military in Vietnam shifted under General William Westmoreland to something called search and destroy. The goal wasn't to take land or hold territory. The goal was attrition, killing the enemy faster than they could be replaced. Here is how it actually worked in the field. The Army would send a small group of Blues, infantry, or a couple of Loaches, small OH-6 scout helicopters, to hover just above the trees. They were looking for the enemy, but more accurately, they were acting as bait. The dark reason the helicopter was so effective was that it allowed the US to use its pilots as a giant tripwire. They would fly low and slow, intentionally exposing themselves to draw fire. The moment the NVA opened fire on the helicopter, they revealed their position. While drawing enemy fire wasn't always the explicit, written tactical goal in every manual, it was an accepted and often leveraged feature of air cavalry doctrine. The pilot wasn't just a driver. He was a sensor designed to be triggered by violence. This led to a terrifying cycle. The moment a pilot took fire, he would radio it in. Within minutes, the slicks, troop carriers, would drop a battalion of infantry behind the enemy, while the guns, heavily armed Huey gunships, would saturate the area with red rain, thousands of rounds of machine gun fire, and 2.75-inch rockets.
The helicopter transformed the infantryman from a slow-moving grunt into a vertical pincer that could close around an enemy in seconds. To understand why the pilots ruled, we have to look at the alternative. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, was incredibly disciplined, well-trained, and possessed an intimate knowledge of the terrain. They knew they couldn't match the US in a fair fight involving tanks or open field maneuvers. The NVA developed a specific counter doctrine called "grab them by the belt buckles." They realized that if they stayed very close to American troops, within 30 yards, the US couldn't use its devastating air power or heavy artillery because they would risk hitting their own men. It was a way to neutralize the massive technological advantage of the American military. But the helicopter pilot broke this doctrine. Unlike a high-altitude bomber or a distant artillery battery, a Huey Cobra or a bushranger gunship could hover just feet above the canopy. They could see individual soldiers through the smoke. They could provide surgical firepower in a way that had never been seen in the history of warfare. They could dip their nose and fire rockets into a specific bunker while American grunts were only yards away. However, this surgical dominance came at a horrific cost. Because the pilots were hugging the belt too, they were within range of everything, from sophisticated Soviet anti-aircraft missiles down to a local farmer with an old bolt-action rifle. By the end of the war, over 5,000 helicopters had been destroyed. Official estimates from the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association document the loss of more than 2,165 pilots and 2,712 crew members. For a ruling class of the sky, they were dying at a rate that would have been completely unacceptable in any other branch of the military. The dark reason for their success was their willingness to operate in the kill zone at all times. Let's talk about a detail most people miss: the seats. In a Huey, the pilots sat in armored buckets. These were heavy, ceramic-plated seats designed to stop a .30 caliber round coming through the floor. This is a perfect example of the engineering details matter pattern. The military realized that a Huey was replaceable. It was just metal and glass, but a trained pilot was not. They didn't armor the engine, they didn't armor the fuel tanks effectively at first, they armored the man. Yet, there was a deep psychological toll. Pilots often placed extra chicken plates, portable body armor, under their feet or sat on their heavy flight helmets. Why? Because they knew the dark reason they were there was to be shot at. They knew that in this war, the front line was exactly 1/8 of an inch of aluminum beneath their boots. They lived in a state of hypervigilance, knowing that the very mobility they provided was what made them the enemy's #1 target. As the war dragged on, the Huey evolved. We saw the birth of the UH-1 Cobra, the world's first dedicated attack helicopter. It was narrow, fast, and designed for one thing only: killing. The lessons learned by the pilots in the meat grinder of the Central Highlands led directly to the development of the UH-60 Blackhawk and the AH-64 Apache. The modern US Army doesn't just use helicopters, it is fundamentally built around them. But here's the paradox. Even after the Apache was introduced, the Huey concept never truly died. Its influence is everywhere in modern doctrine. The idea of vertical envelopment, using air mobility to bypass difficult terrain and strike at the enemy's heart, is now the gold standard for every major military on Earth. The dark reason America's pilots ruled Vietnam wasn't because they were invincible. It was because they were the ultimate disruptors. They forced the enemy to fight a war on 3 dimensions when they were only prepared for 2. So why do we remember the Vietnam helicopter pilot with such reverence and awe? It's because they occupied a unique, terrifying space in history. They were the bridge between the old world of boots on the ground and the new world of technological dominance. They weren't just flying missions, they were participating in a massive, high-stakes engineering and sociological experiment. Every time a pilot popped smoke in a hot LZ to guide in the reinforcements,
He was testing a theory written by men in air-conditioned offices in Virginia. A theory that said mobility could replace manpower, and that firepower could replace a clear political goal. The pilots ruled the sky, but the dark reason remains as a haunting legacy. They were the most vital, most exposed gears in a machine of attrition that eventually ran out of fuel. They were the masters of a sky that offered no safety, only the chance to be the first into the fight. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the engineering and tactics of the Vietnam War, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.